Hey, welcome, folks. Glad to have you with us. Glad to be with you. This special program, it is on the Constitution. We'll touch a little bit on the Declaration of Independence, what the Founding Fathers wanted. I am pleased to tell you that Roger Pilon is with us, and he is the founder and director of the Cato Institute's Center for Constitutional Studies. And when we left off, we promised we'd kind of talk about some of the things that have happened to the Constitution over the course of its life, and most importantly, those things that happened in the 20th century, because I think that, and I think Roger would agree, is where things really started to change. Roger, welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be back with you. And let's indeed turn to how it is that things started to fall apart, and they did so during the Progressive Era, which was institutionalized in the New Deal. But let me just take a moment to set the stage for that discussion. Remember, the Constitution was written to ensure liberty through limited government. And in so doing, it was reflecting the philosophy of government that the Founding Fathers had when they drafted the Declaration of Independence. That document sets forth their idea of individual liberty secured by limited government. It is rooted in the theory of rights that we inherited that goes all the way back to the natural law tradition from antiquity, the Greeks, the Romans, the law that developed property and contract, the common law that evolved over some 500 years where judges developed the theory of rights, John Locke drawing all of this together, and then Jefferson drawing upon Locke's theory to draft those famous phrases in the Declaration. And that was, 11 years after the Declaration was written, incorporated in the Constitution itself, which sets forth essentially the idea that we the people, for the purposes that are set forth in the preamble, do ordain and establish the Constitution. In other words, all power comes from the people. They give some of that power to the government that they establish through ratifying the Constitution. And those powers that they do give are set out in the document. The doctrine of enumerated powers makes it clear that it's a document of limited powers. And then the Bill of Rights was added 2 years later. The 9th and 10th Amendments make that theory of government crystal clear. There was, of course, the oblique recognition of slavery, our cardinal sin. It took a civil war to end it, the passage of the Civil War amendments that for the first time applied the Bill of Rights against the states. That can be seen as completing the Constitution by incorporating the grand principles of the Declaration at last into the document itself. And during the last decades of the 19th century, we lived largely under this idea of liberty through limited government. But now we come to the great change, the great watershed, and it began at the end of the 19th century and in the early decades of the 20th century in the name of the Progressive Era. And that was an era in which we had a fundamental shift in the climate of ideas, whereas the founding and subsequent generations saw government as a necessary evil, something to be guarded against as it's doing the things that we authorize it to do. The progressives saw government as an engine of good, an instrument through which to solve all kinds of social and economic problems. It was to be, if I may paraphrase the DuPont ad from several years ago, better living through bigger government. They were drawing upon European ideas, which may sound familiar in today's context. Bismarck had introduced his social security scheme in Germany. In England, you had utilitarianism replacing natural rights theory in ethics, the idea that law, policy, judgment, etc., were to be justified not with reference to whether they secure our rights, but rather with reference to whether they serve the greatest good for the greatest number. So what you have in that shift is a stepping back from individualism and toward a kind of socialist view of the world. It was a move from law as principle, as adjudicated by judges, to law as policy as written by legislatures. The whole idea then became, what shall we do as a people? Shall we have a retirement system? Shall we have a health care system? Shall we provide for daycare subsidies? And you can go on and on in this vein. But this was the kind of mindset that was coming out of the progressives. You saw it early on in the Republican side in the form of Teddy Roosevelt, but you see it far more in the Democratic side in the form of Woodrow Wilson, and of course especially in the New Deal in the administration of Franklin Roosevelt. And I'd be glad now to go into some detail about how the actual implementation took place in the New Deal.
Well, I am kind of curious about that, but I do want to start a little bit before the New Deal. I want to start with some changes that had to do with, for instance, the Founding Fathers gave us a beautiful system where the Senate was appointed by the states and the representatives were voted on by the people. So you had one side fighting for the good of the state, the other fighting for the good of the people. And then you had this mechanism for collecting funds. You apportion the debt to the several states. It was a perfect way to keep government under control. But around about 1913, things started to change there. And that's, I guess, a good deal of time before the New Deal.
Absolutely. In fact, those are perfect examples of the mindset of the progressive era. First of all, in order to do all these things they wanted to do through government, they needed the wherewithal, taxes. And that's the 16th Amendment, which for the first time instituted constitutionally an income tax. That was supposed to be very small, 1 or 2%, affecting only the very richest people. But of course, we all know that once you establish it, it's only a matter of time before it reaches more and more people and gets larger and larger. The second point to which you pointed, Gary, was the 17th Amendment, which removed the appointment of senators by the state legislatures and put them to popular election, and therefore diminished the role of the states as states in serving as a check on the federal government. And I'll just make one other thing, too, that you didn't mention, and that's a prohibition. Another perfect example of how progressives wanted to do good through government by prohibiting people from imbibing in alcohol. And we all know the hypocrisy and the crime that arose as a result of that. It's the same kind of thing we have today with the war on drugs.
Roger, let me roll back a little bit here. When they were selling the income tax, I mean, I understand why somebody making at the time probably $3,000 a year, which is probably like $40,000 a year today, but I can understand why they would say, "Yeah, go ahead if you're just going to raise taxes on the very wealthiest 1%." But I'm curious, was part of the salesmanship? Do you know if part of the salesmanship was? We just don't have enough money to get the job done and we need to do this, or was it's more fair? Do you have any idea what the argument was?
Well, it was both of those, but it was met by the argument on the other side that we need more money to do this, that, and the other thing. We're not authorized to do this, that, and the other thing, so therefore we don't need the money to do it. And so, you see, only if you undermine the Constitution does that argument start to make sense. And, of course, that's exactly the direction that they were moving, and it did not reach fruition until the 1937-38 revolution.
And curiously, the wealthy people, the ones who were actually obliged to pay an income tax, they were so proud of the fact that they were making so much money that they had to pay a tax, they were actually proud of it.
Yes, and we see the same thing today with some of the wealthiest people, Bill Gates, his father, his senior Mr. Gates, and others, very wealthy people who are calling for raising taxes because they are beyond the point where it really matters to them. As economists would tell you, what really matters is what happens at the margin. It's the people who make $200,000, $300,000 a year who may seem like rich people to folks out, say, in the middle of Kansas, where the cost of living is so much lower. But when you live in places like New York, Washington, Hawaii, San Francisco, and the like, believe me, $200,000, $300,000 a year does not make you rich remotely, because the taxes and the cost of living in these domains is so much higher. And so what happens is that when you impose those taxes on people like this, they start to change their behavior. It's happening right now in California, where we're seeing that because taxes and regulations are so onerous, people are leaving the state.
All right, we're going to have to pause here in a minute, but I want to come back and talk to Roger Pilon from the Cato Institute, who is, by the way, the director of the Constitutional Studies, Center for Constitutional Studies. I want to ask him about one more thing before we head into the 1930s, the big changes. I want to talk to him about the Federal Reserve, the impetus behind creating that. Why does it even exist? So we'll come back. We'll cover that ground as well. If you've just joined us, we are indeed talking with Roger Pilon. He is the B. Kenneth Simon Chair in Constitutional Studies, Director of Center for Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute, and was frankly a tutor for me. I actually sat down and had a couple of chats with him in order to go out and talk about the Constitution. And he's spending his holiday with us today to tell you about the Constitution. Gary Nolan Show, the Zimmer Radio Network.